The province of Quebec is planning to ban prayer in public. Now, this is not a particularly surprising story in a lot of ways because Quebec, since the silent revolution of the 1950s, the quiet revolution of the 1950s, has been an aggressively secular place. And so the Quebec government has now announced that it's planning to ban prayer in public places as part of a move to strengthen secularism in the province. And the announcement basically makes good on a suggestion put forward last December, which we mentioned on the Bridgehead briefing at the time, by Premier François Legault, who said he doesn't want to see people praying in public parks or streets. So I don't know how many public prayer vigils he's stumbled across, but clearly he's just absolutely fed up with this. And so recently, the secularism minister, which is a thing Quebec has, confirmed that he's going to be tabling legislation this fall to outlaw the practice again of praying in public. And here's what he said in a written statement. The rise of street prayers is a serious and sensitive issue in Quebec. Last December, our government expressed its unease with this growing phenomenon, particularly in Montreal. Now, where does this come from? So it's kind of interesting. The story is a little bit more complicated than it would seem on the face of it, because when somebody thinks of prayer in public, they right away think, okay, here's Quebec's aggressively secular government going after Christians again. But for the most part, it actually isn't Christians who are praying in public. It does happen, but it's not a really common practice. And so the reason that they're announcing this is in response actually to Muslim prayers that have been taking place as part of pro-Palestinian demonstrations, including in front of the Notre Dame Basilica in Montreal. And so there's been a lot of tensions here with the Montreal Jewish community, with Palestinian protesters who are choosing to pray outside the Catholic cathedral. And the secularism minister didn't say whether the government would invoke the notwithstanding clause, which would allow their new bill, which we haven't read yet, so we can't really get into the details, to override certain sections of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But last year, the premier did say they were considering that possibility. But it's really interesting because on one hand, this is the same problem you had in France, where you actually had in France a couple of years back, they banned burkini swimwear on the beaches because it was offensive to the secularist ideals of France. And so basically what they said was you have to be wearing a bikini, you have to be dressed very immodestly in order to go to the beach at all. And you're kind of trapped with these aggressively secular culture warriors who want to combat the influence of Islam on the public square, but do so by passing legislation that ends up criminalizing a whole range of religious practices from a whole range of religious groups. And it makes it kind of sticky, and it highlights sort of the tensions in a multicultural society. And of course, the Quebec government has previously banned public expressions of faith in public institutions, including the Huguenot cross, the Catholic crucifix, and things like that. But here's how the premier actually talked about the ban. And this is a direct quote from the premier. Seeing people on their knees in the streets praying, I think we have to ask ourselves the question, I don't think it's something we should see. Now, obviously, I find that statement very problematic. I get that what he's probably referring to is the Palestinian demonstrators in front of a Catholic cathedral. And they're doing this, obviously, to incite tension. They're doing this in order to draw attention to their cause. They're doing this to attract media attention. But the reality is that an anti-prayer ban is a crackdown on all religious groups. My religious tradition is not a huge fan of praying in public in general. At the same time, it's hugely problematic to ban the practice. It is obviously in contravention of religious freedom. And of course, one of the major groups responding first was the Canadian Muslim Forum, which said it was deeply concerned by the news because a, quote, blanket ban would stigmatize communities, fuel exclusion, and undermine Quebec's social cohesion. That's definitely stretching it a little bit because obviously Muslims praying outside a Catholic cathedral is a threat to Quebec's social cohesion or whatever there is left of it. And the legislation is definitely part of a larger push by the province's Coalition Avenir Quebec government to expand secularism rules, including extending the province's workplace ban on religious symbols to all public school staff. So this comes after an independent committee made 50 recommendations to the government earlier this week on how to strengthen secularism. So it's really interesting. Since the Quiet Revolution, before which Quebec was a very Catholic place, secularism has become the new de facto state ideology. And secularism sets itself against all religious traditions. And so there was a nearly 300-page report from this committee which suggested limiting religious accommodations and then extending the religious symbol ban even to daycare workers. And so the committee, which was headed up by 2 lawyers, also looked at the question of public prayer, but actually stopped short at the time of recommending a blanket ban. And instead, the report said municipalities should be able to deal with this. And they said they wanted to strike a balance between upholding Quebec's collective values, which are secular, if secular values are even such a thing that exists, and the, quote, preservation of a religious practice that do not unduly harm public order. Now, what's interesting is that when you see a ban on public prayer, with the argument being put forward by advocates of this ban saying, we still have our churches, we still have our synagogues, we still have our religious buildings, and we can pray inside those buildings, we can pray inside our homes. So this ban isn't really an onerous infringement on religious freedom, kind of ignores the fundamental concept of religious freedom. And Al Mohler wrote about this in a book almost 10 years ago now, where he made a distinction between freedom of worship and freedom of religion. And I think what he wrote there kind of highlights what we see happening in Quebec right now. Mohler wrote the following: even while religious liberty is supposedly recognized and affirmed, it is often being transformed and minimized. The Obama administration provided a classic example of this. Numerous representatives of the administration, including the president himself, shifted their language from freedom of religion to freedom of worship. Though these two phrases may appear to be very similar, freedom of worship is a severe and deadly reduction of freedom of religion. Religious freedom is not limited to what takes place within the confines of a church building and its worship. Freedom of worship marginalizes and ghettoizes Christian speech so that its liberties only exist within the confines of a church facility, but it does not guarantee a right to a public voice. Freedom of worship essentially muzzles the Christian in the public square. And so that's what Quebec is essentially trying to do, is saying you have freedom of worship, but you don't actually have freedom of religion. The public space is a place where prayer, a form of Christian speech, obviously, and a form of speech for other religious groups, is now formally illegal because, as the premier says, we shouldn't be seeing people on their knees in public. And so the head of the Anglican Diocese of Quebec, Bruce Myers, said he wants to see what the bill says, but calls it very problematic and a very heavy-handed solution to a problem that really doesn't seem to exist. And then he said this, who is going to determine what constitutes prayer? A government official? The impression is left from what the Minister for Secularism has said and what the Premier has said in the past, that this is kind of based on the assumption that prayer is strictly an internalized thing that's restricted to a specific time and place, and that's not just for the case for any religious expression or faith community that I know of. Now, we kind of talked about this in the context of the UK ban on silent prayer near abortion clinics. And just to kind of give you an idea of where this kind of law could head, there's a really sinister video clip that I didn't mention previously, but is in the new documentary series by Angel Studios, Live Not By Lies, where you actually see a police officer approaching somebody with her eyes closed and her head down and says very menacingly, "Are you praying for the lives of unborn children?" And so a ban on public prayer would very obviously also apply to 40 days for life outside of abortion clinics. Abortion happens more in Quebec than pretty much anywhere else in Canada. They have the highest rate of late-term abortions. They have the highest rate of third abortions, for example. And so obviously a law like this would absolutely apply to 40 days for life, where you have Protestants and Catholics who are praying outside of abortion clinics for the lives of unborn children. So obviously, the Quebec ban, it's more complicated on its face than just a prayer ban. They're clearly trying to respond to the problem of pro-Palestinian protesters who are praying outside a major Catholic cathedral in Montreal in a way that the government and others considers very disruptive. But the ban they're coming at us with is basically a club that will ensure that freedom of religion is replaced with freedom of worship. And that is a dangerous and severe curtailing of religious liberty in Canada. Thank you so much for listening to The Bridgehead today. If you found the commentary helpful, again, please do like the video or share it around. Subscribe to the channel. That's very helpful for us. And thank you so much for your time. We'll see you again next week.